The stone lid slammed down over the novice's shoulders before the occult researcher finished the last step into the pit. Candlelight spat against the wet stone, and the initiate's knees hit packed earth. Breath came fast and shallow. Suspicion pressed along the researcher's spine like a cold coin. He had come expecting secrecy, but not this deliberate violence. He moved closer, hand on the leather-bound notebook at his belt, and watched the high priestess lay her palm on the novice's head. Suspicion shaped every choice the researcher would make that night. He did not ask permission, and he did not smile. He had a tattered permit folded into his coat, a permit that might buy him a look or a beating. He had come because the ledger rumors pointed to one family name, and because one line in an old registry had been scratched out in the same hand that had signed his father's burial record. He stepped back into the shadow of the antechamber as the guard pushed him toward the scribe. A guard grabbed his sleeve. "Permit, stranger," the guard said, voice low. The researcher extracted the paper and flattened it with careful fingers. "Occult researcher," he answered, "Esmerin's permission. I asked to examine the inner doctrine." His voice was measured. He kept his chin level and let the scribe read. The scribe's eyes flicked up and down the paper. The scribe smelled of dust and drying ink. He hesitated. "The doctrine is sealed to the uninitiated. The scribe, high priestess, chooses who sees." The researcher did not step back. He kept the permit visible and let his palms show the smudges of ink from a dozen hours with other scrolls. The dispute, access for knowledge, was the problem clenched at the root of the temple's life. The researcher pressed. "Scribe, I have citations. I know marginalia exist in scroll 10. Let me see the scroll chamber for a moment." That sentence started the negotiation. The scribe swallowed and called for the elder acolyte. Two guards shifted their spears, and the high priestess' shadow slid along the corridor like a moving wall. They led him past candles that guttered against stone, past a teaching alcove where a public lesson had just ended. The high priestess stood in the center as the novice who had been forced into the pit lay propped against the column, face pale and sweating. A second initiate held a leather ledger with trembling fingers. The high priestess traced a symbol on the stone floor and spoke in a voice that had taught generations to obey. "High priestess." The researcher, without lowering his eyes. "I must see what's kept from the people. I will record what I find." The high priestess glanced at the drooping novice and then to the scribe. "We do not display that to outsiders." Her gaze was not curious. It was protective. Her hand moved to the ledger and she tapped a name. The crowd of initiates parted when she touched the book. For the lesson she required, she announced, "Names bind, names release. The keeping of names is the keeping of power." She spoke plainly, and then, in front of everyone, she slid the ledger's pen across a single line and gouged a name from the page. The novice who had just taken the oath gave a small sound and went dark, eyed for a full breath. The researcher stepped closer, fingers tightening around the strap of his satchel. He noted the way the high priestess's thumb left a waxy smear on the ledger's spine. When he reached for the ledger under a pretense of examining script, her gaze found him. He felt the second emotion shift, first suspicion into a steady anger. His mouth set. He would not leave without evidence. In the scroll chamber they unrolled an aged piece of parchment under a single shaft of light. The scribe unwound the scroll with hands that shook, while the elder acolyte kept a silent watch. "This is public myth," the scribe muttered. The version taught to the outer court. The researcher traced the glyphs with his fingertip and felt the roughness of ritual ink. He found the marginalia in the lower fold, a scratch of hurried penmanship in the same iron, read as the main text. It contradicted the temple's folding story. It named an origin that the public lessons erased. He read the short note aloud because he wanted the scribe to hear it from him. "This is a record of those removed from memory," he said. The scribe inhaled so sharply that the candle flame flickered. "Who wrote that?" "The researcher, scribe, the marginalia who scratched this." The scribe shook his head. Not me. Not in my hand. He looked at the elder acolyte. We keep only what is sanctioned. That note. He swallowed. It should not be here. The researcher felt the second emotion shift harden into fear. His heartbeat sharpened at the base of his throat. If the marginalia contradicted official myth, then the temple had practices designed to break recall itself. That conviction propelled him to pry deeper. He worked the false panel in the bindery with a key he borrowed from a reluctant acolyte. The secret ledger lay behind the plaster, a narrow book bound in cracked leather, its edges browned and scorched. He opened it and found living names written in a tight, all-cap hand, each followed by a mark, Elias Morsa, erased. His finger hovered over one line. The name seared through memory like a hot iron. He recognized the family name, Morsa. His breath caught, Elias Morsa. He muttered, Elias Morsa. The scribe looked up with new attention. The elder acolyte's jaw tightened. The researcher had not come for family. He had come for truth. Yet this was the moment the personal and the professional collided. You know that name. The scribe, I do. The researcher. He forced control in his voice. He felt an urge to turn the page and see more, but the ledger hummed like a held breath under his fingers. He had his worn leather notebook open now and began to copy lines while the elder acolyte watched. The researcher recorded the erased names into cipher, careful of line breaks and margins, as if the act of copying might tether them in his own memory. He had crossed a line. The high priestess entered the bindery without knocking. She studied the researcher as someone assessing a knife's edge. You read what you were not given to read, she said. You will pay. Her voice did not rise. It had the stillness of a judgment. I read what the house kept to itself. The researcher answered, names sealed do not belong to one woman. He placed his palm over the ledger to mark the page. He saw the high priestess' eyes move to the tear in his coat where a faded ribbon was sewn, an old family token. Her expression changed by a width the researcher could not name. In the central sanctum, the researcher lifted a rolled seal wrap from a shelf. The seal was a parchment folded and bound with black thread. The high priestess had warned him away from that row. The researcher did not think, he acted. He untied the thread and read a sealed passage aloud with a scholar's cadence, articulating the consonants the way his notes recommended. Words left his mouth and the chamber reacted. Candles dipped and the skin along his forearms tightened. Initiates staggered as if struck. The researcher felt a physical itch in the part of his head where his family portrait used to hang, names and dates, frayed at the edges of his recall. He tried to stop and could not. The passage finished and silence landed like a dropped tray. For a moment the researcher expected applause or condemnation. Instead, the initiates sat with hands pressed to their temples, eyes wet with sudden tears. The elder acolyte dropped into a hard crouch and began whispering a counter phrase. The high priestess' mouth moved, shaping words of containment. A priest guard lunged forward. Hands closed on the researcher's arms. He did not resist at first. He wanted to measure the reaction. A guard pressed his fingers into the researcher's wrist until the bone creaked. You read forbidden text, the guard said. You have broken the seal. The researcher heard the edge of something else in the guard's tone, relief. He realized the guards had been waiting for this exact transgression. The high priestess stepped close. You have opened a wound we do not show to the world, she told him. We can spare the people's minds if you relinquish what you have found. Burn the marginalia and the ledger, and we will ease the memory that strikes among the initiates. Her eyes searched his face. Destroy the evidence, and we will bind the backlash to your name instead of theirs. The researcher had moved beyond suspicion now. Anger had sharpened into a different instrument. He looked at the initiates on the floor, at the small trimmers in hands he had seen cradle the ledger, at the novice who had been forced into the pit and who now clutched at his throat. He measured costs and saw that the high priestess offered a trade he might never accept if guilt had no practical end. He answered with a question more than a refusal. Who writes the marks? Who erases the names? The high priestess did not blink. We do. Those names? She touched the ledger as if it were skin. We remove names when the cost of the recall outweighs the danger of knowledge. We keep the peace. Her voice was plain. You will not understand unless you have given an oath. The researcher shook his head. I will not burn a record. I will not let the living be struck blind for curiosity. He felt the elder acolyte step closer, fingers twitching near a blade. There was an argument then that ran like a small storm. High priestess, this is madness. The scribe, we are scholars. We bind knowledge, we do not hide it by violence. Scribe, you keep the outer lesson. Do not pretend you write true history, the high priestess replied. Elder acolyte, hold them, said the guard. Occult researcher, do you think your papers will protect you? The rapid exchange included 3 short rebuttals, then 2 sharp commands as the guards moved in. A desperate bargain followed. The high priestess lowered her voice and proposed, you can save the initiates' minds if you destroy the marginalia. Destroy your notes and hand the piece you carry to me. She named the exchange clearly, step by step. The researcher weighed a single life against the knowledge. Action decided for him. He took from his satchel the marginalia copy he had made on thin paper and set it on the stone table. If you bind them, bind me too, he said. Take my recall of what you read and spare their names. He pressed the paper to the flame. His face showed the third emotion shift, fear into grim resolve. He burned the copy while the high priestess watched the edges curl. Her bargain held a weight he had mismeasured. The elder acolyte moved then, not to seize, but to offer a hand. You have given one thing back, the elder acolyte. Now give us the other, and we will release one name. He pronounced the offer plainly, and the researcher felt the ledgers rose as if they pulled at his coat. They bound him with a rope that smelled of beeswax and old hair. The guards ran a ritual of forgetting over his head, musicless syllables, breath counted to 3. And for 3 heartbeats the researcher felt the details of his childhood reorganize. He clung to a single image, a house on a salt road and his mother's hands closing a gate. Then a line around his life blurred. When he came to himself, the chamber hummed, and there was a new absence behind his eyes. The high priestess stood inches away, expression steady. You will take nothing of ours into the wide world, she said. You will carry one charred scrap home, and you will know enough to speak, but not enough to lead others here. Live with the partial knowledge as a sealed wound. The researcher had to make a decision within the span of a held breath. He could comply and save the initiates from further psychic rupture, or he could refuse and risk that the backlash would ripple outward and take more faces. He thought of Elia's morso in the ledger and of the way the high priestess had touched the ribbon on his coat. He felt responsibility as a physical pressure behind his ribs. He chose to save the living. They loosened the ropes when the elder acolyte promised a favor in return, a future access if the researcher accepted conditions. The guards stayed close. During a ritual distraction in the outer alcove, a contrived lamentation and the sudden off-key chanting of a novice, the researcher slipped free of a loosened knot. He bolted through a narrow stair toward the surface. He had one physical proof in his hand. A single charred fragment of the sealed passage, black at the edges, the sigil still faintly visible beneath suit. He ran until the dawn air sliced the sweat on his skin. Dawn found him at a small window of his dusty study, the fragment on the table under a thin beam of light. He catalogued the charred scrap with pencil strokes. He wrote each curve of the faded sigil into his notebook. He listed the erased names he remembered. As he worked, his hands trembled with a new kind of knowledge, the knowledge of what secrecy could do when institutionalized. The chapter's conflict had resolved. He had acquired a piece of forbidden text and kept the lives of several initiates intact. He had traded a full memory for the safety of others. He had learned the temple's method. Yet the evening had gifted him a surprise twist. When he turned the ledger's page in his memory, one name left a different impression. The family name Morsa was not merely erased by ritual. A binding amendment tied that family to the temple's founding. The temple had not only removed memory, it had rewritten relations. At dawn, the researcher placed the charred fragment beside the ledger excerpt he had copied earlier and realized he lacked a single connective line. Why the Morsa family had been singled out, the scribe's hesitant face returned to him. The elder acolyte's promise of future access echoed. He had saved the initiates and lost the ability to read the passage in full. He folded his hands around his cup of cooling tea and listened for the street noise below. A knock came at the study door while he catalogued the names. He did not start. He set the pencil down and walked to the door. The knock was direct, 3 deliberate taps. He opened the door to find the scribe standing on the threshold, cloak wet with the night's condensation, eyes narrow. Scribe. The researcher. The scribe did not duck inside. He held up a small scrap of a wax seal, the temple's emblem. They let you keep a piece. The scribe, they spared those minds. But they asked me to give you this that morning. He offered the seal. Keep it. You will need someone inside when the time comes. The scribe's voice softened. The elder acolyte's earlier promise breathed new meaning through that single gesture. The researcher accepted the seal. He slid it into his pocket and closed the door. He set the charred fragment back on the table and watched the shadow of the wax curl under the morning light. He had one concrete thing that bound him to the temple now, a token from an uneasy ally and a ledger that listed names erased by design. He felt the aftertaste of dread, specific and sharp, not spread into empty metaphors but lodged as a fact. The temple could and would erase citizens' connections, and the researcher had only a single burned scrap and one secret ally to push back. He returned to his notebook and wrote, in careful short lines, the names he could still trace and the high priestess' exact words. He closed the book and slid the leather notebook beneath his coat, wrapped the charred fragment in oiled cloth, and put both into his satchel. He locked the study and left the room to find a street seller already calling out the morning's fish. As he stepped into the day, a single concrete knock at his window broke the chapter's quiet. He paused on the threshold, hand on the latch. He turned once to the table where the ledger fragment sat under its band of light, then closed the door behind him. The next step would be to decode the temple's amended records. The first step was to find out who Elias Morsa had been before the house took his name. The knock at his window came again, this time a sound he recognized from the temple steps. And he realized he had not yet understood how close the price for knowledge would reach. He pried the rusted chest lid with both hands, and the leather cradle that should have held a ledger lay torn and empty. The cloth wrappings had been slit, and the air smelled of smoke and beeswax. Suspicion drove his fingers into the ragged edge of the lining. He found a singed corner caught on a staple and a smear of dark ink on the wood. The occult researcher paused, jaw tight, and barked an order without looking up. Archivist. Where is the ledger? He said. The vault echoed with a dry scrape. Within 3 breaths, a heavy wooden door banged and a thin, pale man stepped into the candlelight. The man set a narrow lamp on a crate and did not meet the researcher's eyes. Orders came from above. The archivist. He folded his hands over the lamp as if hiding papers. The researcher watched him square his shoulders and heard the calm lie in the archivist's voice. Suspicion, then irritation, moved through the researcher. He clicked the brass magnifier against his palm and counted the seconds before speaking again. He had been in pits and sanctums before. He had felt stone lids close around novices and the damp press of initiation air. He remembered the pit where the stone lid slammed down over the novice's shoulders and the initiate's breath had sounded small and fast. That memory tightened his jaw now and pushed him toward the question he would not leave unanswered. Explain the cut, the researcher. Explain the scorch. He set the leather. bound notebook on the crate and tapped a page with a finger that left a smear of coal dust. The archivist swallowed. We were told to remove certain lines, not destroy. Remove them from circulation. He kept his voice low. Not all of us agreed. The researcher stepped closer, the lamp-rim light finding the thin ritual crescent under his own left eye. He spoke the word that guided him, suspicion. It directed every motion, where to touch, which seemed to probe, which question to press. The vault smelled of beeswax and old glue. Shelves leaned with boxed fragments, clay tags dangling on twine. The researcher ran fingertips along a shelf until his knuckles found a gouge made by a hurried chisel. He found traces of soot in the groove. Someone moved this fast, he said. Someone who knows how to erase proof cleanly. The archivist's mouth tightened. We have high initiators with power here, the archivist replied. We obey orders. We protect the order. His voice hardened into a defensive rhythm. They argued in short lines. Archivist, the researcher, name names. I want tea, the archivist answered. You will drag more blood if you force me. The exchange sped into a 5-line back and forth. The researcher pressed, the archivist dodged, and then the vault door banged again. An initiate slipped in, hair damp, hands trembling, and stopped a step inside as if the light shocked her. I shouldn't be here, she said, breathing quickly, but I saw them take pages last month. I heard them say the missing passage must be kept. They threatened anyone who spoke of it. Her voice broke on the last sentence. The researcher swung his head and named the exact danger. Who threatened you? He asked. She swallowed and steadied her shoulders the way people do when they want to be believed. They spoke in the sanctum, to the high initiator's clerk. Name after name. If you read the missing line, they said, you caught disappearance. Her fingers worked at the hem of her sleeve. She the word that made the researcher lean forward. Disappearance. The researcher listened and took notes, his pen scratching in a start counterpoint to the initiate's breath. He where she had seen the pages. She the outer cloakroom, a locked trunk, the same rusted chest. She described what she had smelled, ashes and beeswax, and the shape of ink strokes she recalled. Tight circles, a method for binding an oath. The researcher repeated her phrases into his notebook. He spoke names now. Archivist, did you handle the trunk 2 months ago? The archivist flinched and then nodded. I transferred boxes to the cloister store. I did what I was told. His hands, when they moved, trembled. The trimmer became proof the researcher recorded in real time. They moved from accusation to a plan. The researcher wanted proof. The initiate offered a scrap she had slipped from a seam 2 nights before, small, folded, a scrap with a torn edge, and a single line of marginalia. The archivist's eyes widened when he saw it. He put a hand to his throat, then to the table. Where did you get that? The researcher demanded. The initiate's tongue was clumsy, from a seam in the clerk's coat. I could throw it away. I thought. She pressed the scrap into his palm. They sat in the archivist's cramped study, under a single lamp, while he closed the shutter and barred the door. The researcher held the scrap against the lamp and watched ink under magnification. The marginalia were penciled sigils rubbed into the margin, and under them, so faint it took a breath to see, was a number and a letter. An oath, binding index. The archivist whispered, that is the binding mark. We used it in conscription rites. It erases recall and binds obedience. He swallowed the words like something bitter. We were told to keep it secret to protect people. Then we were told to remove the pages. Then the orders grew sharper. Not protection anymore, enforcement. I don't agree, but I obey. His hands tightened on the table, and his knuckles went white. Doubt shifted into anger. The researcher pulled his coat closer and said, Archivist, if you kept a copy, give it to me. I have nothing, the archivist. He paced once, then stopped by the shelf. You saw the torn cradle. We were forced to cut the ledger, remove a passage. I shredded what we could not surrender. His voice lowered. We were told someone would show up and take the rest. I saw them, guards with brass armbands. They to remove the line or the consequences would be. He left the sentence unfinished and let the silence do the work. The researcher closed his eyes for a count and then opened them. We reconstruct. We test whether the binding works the way the marginalia indicate. The archivist looked at him as if he named a dangerous experiment. You want to perform the ritual? He asked. The researcher did not shrink from the question, not a full rite. A controlled procedure. A fragment, a whispered line. If the ledger's words do what they claim, we must know how far it goes. He listed reasons. To free those threatened, to expose the law hidden in doctrine, to prevent more disappearances. The initiate clenched and opened her hands. Fear moved through her now in quick, shallow breaths. They set a place in an abandoned wing used for mending robes. It smelled of stale oil and fabric. They arranged a lamp, a copper bowl, a scrap of ritual ash the archivist had hidden in a wooden file, and the torn marginalia. The researcher steadied the initiate's hand as she held the scrap. Read only the first line aloud, he instructed. He measured each action in short commands so their mouths couldn't bargain. The initiate read the line. Her voice trembled and broke on a consonant. The researcher felt a pressure in the corridor, a breath of air that had no source. He traced the sigil in the air with his fingertip and felt a static tug on his skin. The atmosphere thickened with tangible tension. Then something happened the researcher had not planned. A thin curl of smoke rose from the scrap as the ink glowed faintly, and a low sound like wind in a hollow stone gathered in the rafters. The researcher lunged for the scrap and the initiate shrieked. The archivist slammed his palm down on the bowl, and the sound echoed like a struck bell. They heard feet overhead, a heavy, measured tread. The researcher whispered, "Stop reading." The initiate froze, and the final syllable hung unsaid in her throat. A knock came at the outer door of the wing. 3 knocks, deliberate. Then a voice called through the wood. "Open." Temple guards. The researcher jammed the scrap into his coat and shoved the copper bowl under a bench. He grit his teeth and said, "Archivist, do not move." The archivist's face went pale. He pressed a rag to his mouth as if to staunch his own breath. The researcher took the initiative's elbow and steered her toward a service passage. The archivist stayed a half-beat longer than planned and then joined them. But a hidden cord under his cloak snagged on a hook by the door, and a muffled cry escaped. They fled through low, narrow tunnels lined with slumped ropes and discarded tools. The initiate cuffed against dust as they ducked under a lintel. The researcher carried the scrap like contraband against his chest. He felt the heat of the ink through wool. The footsteps of the guards grew closer above them, then receded down a stair as if the search had been misdirected. They pressed on. Fear sharpened into calculation. Anger cooled into a plan of concealment. At a narrow junction, the archivist stopped. He breathed once, long and ragged. "I cannot go further," he said. "They will search me. They will find what I kept." The researcher turned, hand still on the scrap. "Archivist," he said, voice short. "You can come or you can stay. If you stay, you must burn what remains and take the blame. If you come, you help us find who sent the order." The archivist's lips trembled. The initiate reached for his sleeve. He looked at both of them and then moved like someone who had already decided. "I want to run," he said. "You go. Take the scrap. Take the truth." He stepped back into the shadow of a service door and let it close between them. They heard a shout above and a clang of iron. The researcher shoved the initiate through a maintenance hatch while he jammed a chest against the wooden panel. They crawled into a stairwell that smelled of mildew and old rope. Dawn skinned the sky thin and gray as they tumbled onto a rooftop garret, breath hot and ragged. The initiate sank to her knees and pressed her hands to her chest. The researcher patted his satchel and found the scorched fragment, still in a folded piece of linen. He eased it out and set it on the rough table between them, watching for signs of magic in the smoke, streaked edges. At that moment the researcher counted emotion shifts. Suspicion gave way to anger in the vault. Then doubt flickered into fear during the experiment, and fear hardened into resolve as they fled. He spoke aloud in short sentences to steady the initiate. "We cannot publish this. If we do, the order will vanish evidence and people will disappear. We must either reveal the method so others can guard against it, or we must bury it to protect the living. That is the choice." The initiate's hands shook and she said, "What will you do, researcher?" He named the choice he had already made. "I will learn who enforces silence. I will find the high initiator's clerk and the brass armband men. I will not let this ritual be weaponized." His voice carried a tight steadiness. They examined the scorched fragment under the garret lamp. In the burned scars, the ink had curled and a sigil showed a faint raised texture. The researcher traced it with a fingertip and felt a prickle in his palm. He turned the scrap so the light hit a marginal mark. He realized then that the marginal number matched a ledger code used for conscriptions. 3. Then a letter he recognized from the index he had seen in the archivist's scrap. A twist unfolded for him. The removal of the page was not simply censorship. It was a method to hide conscriptions used to bind recruits into service roles that could not be questioned. That revelation changed how he understood the earlier orders. It made the archivist's obedience less protectiveness and more complicit concealment. He found in the scrap a new detail. A clerk's notation in a cramped hand, dated 2 months earlier, naming a location for a transcript. The researcher, "This leads to a clerk's chest in the cloister. They keep accounting boxes in the east storeroom. If we follow that mark, we find who arranged the removal." The initiate dug out a small map she had memorized from sweeping the storeroom corridors and traced a path with her finger. "The east storeroom," she murmured. "There is a guardhouse at the passage. They will be watching." The researcher nodded and methodized their next move. He delayed long enough to plan precise actions. A quiet infiltration at midday when the shifts changed. A distraction in the guardhouse. The initiate spotting the clerk's chest. He measured risks and gave the initiate 2 tasks. Hold the map and keep the scrap concealed in the linen. He would approach the storeroom as a petition for a clerical correction. The steps, short and specific, and the initiate repeated them. She learned them aloud with crisp errors corrected by his quiet commands. Before they left, the researcher sent his hand across the table and touched the initiate's wrist. "Archivist stayed behind," he said. "He chose to burn evidence to buy us time. Remember that." The initiate nodded and her lips pressed together. She had fear in her face, but also a new steadiness. "We go now," he said. "We gather the clerk's chest. We learn names. We choose whether to expose or bury the method." They crept down the stair to the service passage with the dawn casting thin light through cracks. They passed under a roof tile that had once been dislodged during an earlier search. The researcher checked it with his fingertips and found old scratch marks, proof that others had tested these passages before. They moved toward the east storeroom and the map lay folded in the initiate's palm like a talisman. The researcher kept his coat collar up despite the heat. He felt the linen wrapped fragment heavy in his satchel and listened for voices. He hatched a plan to get the chest by posing as an official auditor who had come to correct inventory. He rehearsed the short lines he would use and then clipped the rehearsals to the rhythm of his breathing. The city below woke to market calls. The cloister bells measured the hour in 3 slow strikes. When they reached the east storeroom, the door was bolted from inside. The researcher knocked with 2 firm taps and said, "Accounts correction. I've been sent by the registry." A guard peered through a small hatch and then drew the bolt. The researcher smiled in a way that was not friendly but efficient. He stepped in with his hands open and made his notes. The initiate slipped behind a stack of chests and watched for the clerk. She saw a thin man with a clerk's scarf move across the room and place a ledger on a table. The researcher engaged him in a quick exchange that kept the clerk's attention long enough for the initiate to slide between chests and lift the lid of a marked box. Inside the chest was folded parchment and a small bundle of pages wrapped in waxed cloth. The initiate's hands trembled as she eased the bundle out, and then froze when the clerk's voice rose. The researcher caught her gaze and mouthed. Now she folded the bundle into her apron and blinked as she walked out, head bowed to appear deferential. The researcher kept his questions short and formal, and then moved to the door. They stepped out into the corridor with the bundle hidden and adrenaline coursing in precise measurement. As they rounded a corner, the researcher felt the weight of a choice pressed behind his sternum. He opened the bundle under an alley eave and found ledger transcripts with red-inked marginalia matching the oath binding marks. He whispered, "This is worse than we thought. They mark recruits to be bound without consent. This is how obedience becomes unchallengeable." The initiate covered her mouth. He set a plan. They would take one transcript and a clerk's notation to the archivist, sold contacts outside the cloister. He would not broadcast the method. He would first force a confrontation that named who enforced the secrecy. They moved fast. At the base of the cloister wall, the researcher paused and looked back through the carved gateway to the cloister courtyard. He thought of the stone lid that had closed in the initiation pit and the novice's shallow breath. He realized that the ledger's missing passage had been erased not only to protect doctrine but to conceal a system that stripped choice. A small decisive rage gathered in his hands. He folded the transcript, tucked it into the satchel with the scorched fragment, and set off toward the archivist's contacts with the initiate at his side. They had only reached the first step of that path when a shadow fell across the alley. Heavy boots stopped at the stair. A bronze gauntlet wrapped the wood of a merchant's stall. The researcher tightened his grip on the satchel and turned toward the sound. He saw a temple guard round the corner, brass armband gleaming. The guard's eyes searched the alley like a sweep. The initiate pressed closer to him and swallowed. The researcher lifted his chin. He had a plan and he had the fragment. He breathed once and took the first step down the alley, toward the guard, toward the choice that would define whether they exposed the ledger and risked more disappearances, or kept the knowledge hidden and let the order continue to wield the binding. He moved forward and his boots struck the cobbles as the guard's bronze armband caught the light. Someone farther up the street called a duty roll. The sound cut across the alley, and the researcher began to walk, the satchel heavy against his side, the scorched fragment weighty in his mind. A thin breeze lifted the edge of a paper on a nearby crate and set it to skitter across the stones. The researcher reached for it, and the paper bore a stamped clerk's seal he recognized. He folded it into his palm like an offered argument and took one more step toward the guard. He forced the carved slab aside and stepped into the chamber as a hooded hand lifted a sealed votive. Suspicion tightened his jaw and pushed him forward. The torch in his left hand threw the initiator's face into a small, sudden relief. The painted crescent under the researcher's eye caught the candle and gleamed like a mark of ownership. "Stop, the initiator who enters the right." The voice cut across the kneeling initiate and the low hum of chants. Within 3 steps, the researcher saw the initiate's shoulders tremble and the votive wax starting to drip. The problem was clear and immediate. A secret rite was unfolding behind a threshold meant to stay closed, and he had found it. He had come because of things he could touch. He remembered the stone lid that had slammed across a novice's shoulders in the old pit, the bruise of darkness under the lid, the rasp of breath against damp stone. He remembered the rusted chest he had pried open earlier and the singed corner of cloth clinging to a staple. Those images kept him moving now. Suspicion had turned into a steady, physical pressure that guided his hands and feet. He kept the torch low and stepped so his boots left no new marks on the worn tiles. The initiate's head stayed bowed. The initiator held the sealed votive at eye level and did not look at the researcher. Around the altar, 4 figures in wool cloaks watched him with hands folded. The room smelled of beeswax and scorched mar. The researcher, I am not here for violence. I want the ledger, he spoke without flourish, his voice low and direct, because suspicion had ruled out subtleties. Ledger. The initiator repeated, who sent you? He shifted the votive, revealing a band of scratched symbols across his knuckles. The researcher kept his torch steady and answered, no sender. I came because the ledger vanished. The city has questions. The initiator's eyes flicked toward the kneeling figure. The kneeling figure's fingers flexed against the flagstone. Tension tightened the room into small motions. The initiator moved one step forward and set the votive on the altar. You saw the lid, he said. You know the pit. The researcher nodded once. I saw a lid. I pried a chest. There was a singed edge. The ledger is part of that same thread. He did not say I remember as a claim. He showed the sealed memory in his palms. A charred scrap he carried tucked inside a small tin, the smell of smoke still clinging to it. Suspicion and a need for proof pushed him to speak plainly. The initiator's face did not soften. Secrets protect us, he said. Secrets bind us. The researcher stepped closer. Secrets also bind others. Who decides which lives deserve that protection? The initiate lifted his head enough for the researcher to see the pale crescent tattoo hidden behind his ear, and the way his knuckles looked raw. Initiate. The researcher. Using the single name, tell me what you saw when the seal was opened last month. The initiate's lips parted. He blinked as if the question scraped the plaster of his memory clean. The room shifted into argument. The archivist, a compact figure in a dark robe, crawled from behind the statue alcove and lay on his stomach to peer at the altar base. Archivist. The researcher. Help me. Tell me if that ledger lists household names tied to the thresholds. The archivist's fingers found a seam in the stone, and he answered with a breath, there are lists. Names, measures, payments, a pattern that reaches the harbor guilds. His voice was quick, composed, edged with exhaustion. A new emotion rose in the researcher. Anger at the thought that ritual secrecy had been used as a structural lever over ordinary lives. The anger showed in the tilt of his head and the way his free hand closed on the torch's handle. He restrained the motion to a controlled forward step. His voice tightened. Then the ledger is not only a sacred list, it is a ledger of control. Give it to me. The initiator barked a short laugh. You would tear it from the altar. He said, I will not tear anything that protects the innocent. The researcher replied, I will not let a ledger become a chain. He set his shoulders square and met the initiator's gaze. For the first time a crack of doubt crossed the initiator's face. The initiator glanced at the group and lowered his voice. Secrecy protects us from the city rulers and from the god's wrath, he said. But secrecy is also a weapon. We use it when we must. The ledger is both. That line shifted the room. It introduced a new, tight fear that secrecy had already been turned into deliberate leverage. There followed a short back and forth that tightened the night's tempo. Archivist. The researcher. Show the ledger. No, the archivist replied. You have no claim. You have no right to hide lists of names that leave families hungry. The researcher answered. You will spill what matters now. You threaten sacred law. The initiator. Sacred law is not for you, the archivist shot back. This chamber has rules. The city outside has rules. We obey different orders. The exchange ran 3 more sharp lines, and then the initiate's hand rose. The initiate did not speak long. Stop, he said, both of you. He turned his head and looked straight at the researcher. I remember the chest, he said, voice flat, concrete. I remember the staple caught the sleeve. I pulled and it snapped. The ledger fell out, open to payments dated 10 winters. My father was on the list. The researcher's breath hitched at the simple clarity of that memory. The emotion shifted again, from anger to a hard, precise sadness that tightened his throat. He felt it in the way his fingertips left a pale ring on the torch handle. The archivist slid his palms against the statue base and found a narrow seam. He worked with steady fingers and produced a folded bundle that smelled of smoke and iron. The cloth was scorched at one corner, matching the scrap the researcher had in his tin. There, the archivist. It has been kept for the right, but it exists. He passed the bundle to the initiator, who peeled back wax, stiff bindings. Marginalia ran along the edge, ledger entries, shortened sigils, and the name of a harbor master. The researcher read in the half-light. He snapped one line into focus. Measures of grain exchanged for silence. Another line listed ward payments tied to threshold openings. The ledger's script tied small villages to orders from patrician houses in the city. Everything coalesced into a concrete picture. Secrecy had been institutionalized as protection and as ransom. He felt the next emotion settle in. Clarity, cold and driving. The researcher stepped forward and touched the parchment with gloved fingertips, tasting dust and old ink. Archivist. The initiator, voice low now. This ledger adapted our rights into civic control. We used it to keep order when governors failed. We used it to silence thieves. We used it to close mouths. The initiate's jaw tightened. My father paid because a threshold was kept open for his boat. The ledger named him as obliged. They called it favor. It felt like a debt. The researcher folded his hands behind his back. He did not speak for a long, careful moment. Two emotions had already shifted him. Suspicion to anger, anger to precise sadness, then to clarity. A sudden movement broke the small circle. The initiate lunged toward the ledger and clutched it to his chest. No, he said. This cannot leave. He pressed the book against his sternum as if it were a baby. The initiator's eyes flashed. You fool, he said. You will not. The archivist grabbed an elbow. Stop. Initiate. The researcher moved faster than his body seemed to allow. He reached and tried to pry the ledger away. The initiate twisted and shoved him back with a shoulder that connected squarely enough to bruise. For a heartbeat the chamber shifted into raw conflict. Hands clutched wool. The votive wobbled and wax spat. The researcher felt his ribs knock against flagstone and tasted iron. He did not shout. He, listen, read one page. Read it aloud. The initiate's mouth pressed into a line. Why should I read? He asked. Because hearing will free you from the oath you cannot name. The researcher. Because names spoken remove some power from them. The initiate's fingers trembled. He opened the ledger at the spot where a sigil had been inked over a column of names. The chamber quieted around the reading. The initiate read in a clipped voice. Harbor Master, 4th Watch. 3 measures. Threshold code 9. The words landed like stones. One of the cloaked watchers hissed and moved away. The initiator's hands clenched. The archivist whispered, Threshold code 9 ties to a governor's release order. The researcher. Then a ruler used our rights to move coins and favors. This is not divinity. It is bookkeeping. The words changed how people looked at each other. The initiator stepped forward and tried to close the ledger. You do not understand, he said. We bind gods to oaths. The ledger holds them to the promise. The researcher swallowed, feeling the third emotion shift, from clarity into a bitter, tactical resolve. If the ledger binds a god, then tearing it would change the god. If it binds a people, exposing it changes the people's lives. Which do you choose? The initiator's face tightened. We choose preservation, he said. Archivist raised his head. There is marginalia that shows adaptation. The lines were rewritten when harvests failed. Names were added when houses rose. This ledger grew like a city's debt ledger, not like a scripture, the researcher answered. Then the ledger is a living instrument. It will be used again. We must decide who wields it. Voices rose. You will not leave with that page. The initiator warned. You will not reveal our rights. The archivist added. The researcher counted the reactions in quick breaths and made a decision. He moved to wedge himself between the initiator and the altar. Read the sigil aloud, he said to the initiate. Read what is written beside your father's name. The initiate hesitated. He drew a single breath and read. Guardian mark, oathbound guardian, one life pledged for silence. The room stilled. That concrete phrase landed on everyone like a visible bruise. The initiate's hands tightened on the ledger. He looked at the researcher with sudden, stark clarity. You see. The initiate, voice raw, it names me as guardian. Whether I like it or not. He straightened and there was a quick, terrible decision in his face. He stepped past the researcher and toward the narrow threshold that led to the inner sanctum. I will not be bound for others' debts, he said. He planted the ledger on the stone at the threshold and crouched beside it, read the sigil you think you can break. I will not let them turn my father's name into another bond. The researcher felt every muscle in his neck go taut. A mid-chapter cliffhanger unspooled. Would the initiate break his oath or guard it? Time accelerated. The initiator flicked a hand and a shallow dome of smoke rose from the votive. He began the half, right to bind the ledger. A motion of hand against page, a wax smear, a quiet intoned phrase. The archivist snapped a small iron tool from his satchel and began working at the ledger's margin, looking for a sigil to unlock. The researcher and archivist hunched together and peered at the markings. This is not the same script, the researcher. It is a later cipher layered over older entries. The archivist's fingers moved faster. There's a burned fragment soon into the binding, he said. If we can extract it, we might break the oath form. The researcher felt a new emotion. Urgency mixed with a cold tactical calm. They worked in tandem. The archivist held the book open while the researcher pushed his brass magnifier close and traced the groove of ink. They abandoned rhetorical talk for short, sharp exchange. Pass the awl, the archivist. Pass it now, the researcher answered. Done. T press on the seam. I 1T, the archivist. Careful of the ink, the motions were precise. Each small tool scraped into the binding and left micro, crumbs of charred glue. Sweat beaded at the initiator's temple. The initiator chanted under his breath and shuffled ritual steps near the altar. The ledger's spine gave with a faint crack. A burned sliver fell free like a charcoal splinter. The initiator reached with a cupped hand, intent on swallowing it into flame. He moved so quickly that the researcher lunged, a physical impulse that came from years of studying and a lifetime of suspicion. His fingers closed around the page fragment as the initiator's palm met air. The body contact yanked the researcher forward, and the initiate screamed aloud. Give it, the initiator hissed. Hand it over, the researcher held the torn sliver out. Read it, he said to the initiate. Read it now. The initiate's breath came in tight, ragged pulls. He looked at the fragment and then at the group. The room held its breath. The initiate carried the fragment to his mouth, paused, and then forced the words out. He read one name and a practice note aloud. Bind to silence, oath breaks if named publicly. The syllables were blunt and precise. The oath broke the moment he named the condition in concrete language. The audible line removed the ritual's secret power. Immediately the ritual stuttered. The votive sputtered and a smell of singed wax and iron filled the stone air. Some watchers recoiled. The initiator slammed a palm on the altar and shouted, "No!" The archivist stumbled back and dropped his tools. The initiate looked at the researcher as if at the edge of a cliff and said, "You forced my hand." The researcher answered, voice steady, "You read and chose. Initiate. None forced you. You named the condition and freed a home from debt." The room fractured into movement and accusation. Members began to split. One cloaked figure grabbed for the ledger and tried to claim one fragment. Another ran for the narrow stair that led up. The initiator cursed and tried to rally dwindling authority. The archivist gathered the remaining pages and shoved them into a satchel with trembling hands. "We must disperse the texts," he said. "We will scatter what remains into different houses. They will keep parts, and none will hold power alone." The researcher watched and felt the last emotion of the chapter arise. A wary acceptance that secrecy would change form but survive. He did not want that acceptance, but he admitted it in his posture. The initiate stood and faced the initiator. "You used my father's name to buy silence," he said. "You bound me for the sake of a house. I will not be guardian to that ledger any longer." The initiator's hands shook. "You are a child," he said. This is dangerous. You use danger to keep your advantage. The initiate answered, that is all the danger I need to reject. Hands reached, voices rose, and a small scuffle broke. One watcher fled into the corridor. The archivist, with an exhausted, deliberate motion, handed a sealed satchel to the researcher. Take this, he said. Keep a page. Let the ledger's binding be known. The researcher looked down at the heavy cloth weight in his hands. By the time dawn began to pale the stairwell above, the ritual chamber had emptied into clusters. Some left in fury, some in shame, some clutching fragments. The initiator remained near the altar, rubbing his knuckles where the researcher had shoved him. The initiate stood at the narrow threshold holding out his wrist. The researcher took the boy's hand and felt how small and collused it was. What will you do? The researcher, I will go home. The initiate, I will tell my family I am no guardian. I will ask forgiveness from my father for not protecting him. I will name the ledger where others can see it. The initiate's voice had an edge of brittle hope. The archivist lingered and met the researcher's eyes. You have kept old things well, he said. You peeled the rusted chest, found the singed corner. That is why we listen now, the researcher replied. You kept names in ink. I kept a scrap. We are not the same, but we are necessary to each other now. The archivist nodded once and turned to collect the remaining pages he intended to hide among his contacts in the city. The researcher watched him go and felt the concrete fact of the ledger's dispersal settle into his hands. The ledger would not vanish, but its concentrated power would fracture into many small hands. He pocketed the burned sigil fragment the archivist had given him, folding it into his satchel beside his worn leather notebook and the magnifier. A final choice remained, and he made it with a small, practical motion. He folded a torn page he had ripped from the ledger into the inside of his coat. He would bring that page to a public clerk in the market and force an accounting. He would not announce himself as a savior, but as a man with evidence. The researcher adjusted his coat and checked the signet ring engraved with the unreadable sigil. Its weight steadied him. At the stairhead, the first light caught the dust motes and turned the corridor into a band of pale that had nothing to do with omen and everything to do with mourning. The researcher breathed and felt muscles unclench. He did not feel triumphant. He felt practical, tired, and aware that secrecy would mutate rather than vanish. He knew he had moved an instrument of social control into public view. He had forced the ledger's fracture and relied on human choices to carry the fallout. He had acted because suspicion had become a method, and because he preferred the messy clarity of evidence to the polite fiction of silence. He closed the stone stair behind him with a single, controlled motion. The hinge gave a small, clean sound, like a counted exhalation. He slipped the burned sigil fragment into his satchel, closed the stairway stone behind him, and walked toward the city with the ledger's torn page folded against his ribs.